for extending the invitation to the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center to be a part of this event. The Caribbean Community Climate Change Center is an intergovernmental institution that was set up by CARICOM heads of government to coordinate the Caribbean's response to climate change. That was done in 2002, and since then, in 2004, the center has been operational in Belize. It actually represents 15 Caribbean CARICOM countries in the region. We all know that the Caribbean is one of the most vulnerable parts of the world to the effects of climate change. And for us, as the Prime Minister of Dominica has said, is that we are on the front lines of the war on climate change. We are not the ones that cause climate change, because as a region, 35 million people across the Caribbean, we produce less than 2% of the greenhouse gas emissions that causes climate change. And so for us, we are on the front lines, and we're not just saying we're on the front line, we're experiencing the losses and the damages that come from this existential threat that Minister Habet spoke about. And I just want to throw out a little bit of statistics in terms of the impact that climate change is having on our region. Back in 1960, that's a little while ago, Belize was hit by a hurricane that was called Hurricane Hattie. What a lot of people don't know about that hurricane is that it actually wiped out, in a few hours, 600% of Belize's GDP. 600%. In 2017, the country of Dominica was hit by Hurricane Maria, and in 5 hours, it wiped out 226% of its GDP. 2 years before that, Tropical Storm Erica wiped out 90% of Dominica's GDP. On every given year in Belize, without a hurricane, Belize loses the equivalent of 7% of its GDP from climate-related disasters. In the Bahamas, 50% of all its debt is directly linked to hurricanes. In the case of Dominica, obviously, it's more like 90% of the debt. So, in addition to hurricanes, we also have, as Dr. Williams spoke about, you would have heard about the floods, you would have heard about the droughts, we would have seen the forest fires happening in Belize. And what is interesting is that these disasters are now happening at the same time. They're not staggered, so you cannot recover from one before you're hit with the next. So while Belize was hit by a hurricane in the northern part of the country, there was a drought that was impacting the sugarcane farmers. And in other parts of the country, there were floods. So we are, in fact, across the region, these 15 countries are suffering from the effects of climate change. So this topic today about the transition to net zero, it is an interesting one because for us, really, as a region, it is adaptation that is the priority because of the impacts that we are suffering. And so there is, however, you cannot adapt your way out of climate change because the cost of adaptation is going to just get more and more expensive with every incremental increase in global temperatures. And so from CARICOM's point of view, we recognize that in order for us to get to the 1.5 degree or keep 1.5 degree within reach, we all have to chip in. All of our countries have to do their part to help to reach to net zero and to cut global emissions in line with the IPCC's recommendations, which is we need to cut emissions by 45% by 2030, and we need to reach net zero by 2050 if we want to keep 1.5 on the table. But as a region who is suffering on the front lines of climate change, we are already doing a lot. Belize, for example, has about 20% of its oceans that are protected. We're protecting mangroves, we're protecting coral reefs, we're protecting seagrasses, and over 60% of the country still is forested. In Guyana, the vast majority of the country has one of the largest tracts of rainforest. In Suriname, the same thing. You go across those 15 countries, and the amount of land and marine space that is already protected. When you look at the abatement, the mitigation that these ecosystems have towards climate change, per capita, our countries are doing far more than the developed countries are doing in terms of transitioning. So we are, in fact, leading by example. And we are often doing this without resources from anybody else except from recurrent revenues. So we have to recognize that our countries, as small as they are, and as vulnerable as they are, and as impacted as they are by climate change, are already on the front lines of showing the rest of the world how to transition to a net zero world. You heard Minister Habet that says already that Belize is already a carbon sink. And if once we start to look at the data, we may in fact be storing more carbon than we are actually emitting into the atmosphere. So with that said, now clearly we have some areas that can benefit and in which we need as a Caribbean region to transition. Not so much in terms of carbon dioxide reduction, because as I said, we are already only 2%, less than 2%. So if we reduce it by 0.5% or 1%, it's not going to have a major impact on global emissions. But if everybody chips in and do their part, then we can start to move the needle. And so in our region, in the Caribbean region, including Belize, obviously there are some opportunities. And one of the points I want to make about these opportunities is that they also help to build our adaptation to climate change. And so it's a win-win. It's a win in the sense that we're helping the world to cut emissions and to transition to net zero, but for us, it also at the same time builds the adaptive resilience of our countries. So what do I mean by that? For example, one of the sectors that we need to transition across the Caribbean is in the energy sector. Most of our electricity, for example, across CARICOM member states is still generated from fossil fuels, and a lot of it from heavy fuel oil and diesel generation. And obviously, when there is global price fluctuations of oil, the prices of electricity would obviously change. And as a result, we need to transition, so not just because we want to curb global emissions, but also because it makes our economies very vulnerable when we are so responsive to the global shocks in oil prices. But at the same time, transitioning from fossil fuels to a decarbonized electricity using wind, using OTEC, using solar PV, and geothermal, for example, these new energy sources can become an important part of the country's ability to deal with climate shocks. For example, in Barbados, when Barbados was hit by Hurricane Elsa, the storm knocked out the generation from the electricity company. There was no power. And there were 3 pumping stations in Barbados that relied on energy to pump water to the hospitals and to pump water to people's houses. And so no power, no water. And so through a project, we were able to secure financing from Green Climate Fund to build 3 solar PV substations to provide backup to those water pumping stations. So that's renewable energy. That is mitigation. It is avoiding emissions. But most importantly, what it does is that if there's another storm And it knocks out the generation from the diesel generator. There is now solar energy to be able to pump that water to the households and the critical infrastructure. That's what I mean about transitioning to net zero also helps us to adapt to the climate shocks and the effects that were happening. So there's a lot of potential in the energy space to transition. The other big industry or big sector that we can transition in is also in terms of transportation. Transportation is often a large share of our emissions in our countries because it's largely still dependent on fossil fuels. And so we need to look at e-mobility. Again, countries across the region are pursuing e-mobility and transitioning. And the last sector that is very important is the agricultural sector in terms of how we can transition in using technology, using renewable energy to make those sectors resilient. The point I want to make about all of these sectors is that they all require resources, financing, concessional financing, and in some cases, public finance and grants to de-risk a lot of the investments that will be required to transition these industries and sectors to net zero. Belize is already using, for example, innovative financial instruments. They just successfully negotiated a $550 million debt for climate swap, the second largest in the world. Resources from that swap are now being allocated to continued protection of the marine environment. So finally, under Article 6, countries can now look at carbon trading and carbon credits to also mobilize resources as part of the net zero transition. The other part, obviously, is capacity building. And the last important is the technology transfer, which are promises in the Paris Agreement, but for which very little is actually happening to help our countries transition. Our fiscal space, debt, is a major reality in the Caribbean. Most of our countries are well above the 60% of GDP, debt to GDP ratio. And so there's very little space for them to transition. So we actually need the assistance to help with the transition, and that's why you have heard of the Bridgetown Initiative, which is seeking to mobilize financing at scale and at concessional rates that would assist our countries. So for us, to end, for us, adaptation is obviously a priority, but we recognize that to keep 1.5 alive, it requires everybody to do a lot more to cut emissions. But we are already leading the world in ensuring that we are preserving and protecting our environment that are important carbon sinks, and by so doing, we are actually doing more than our fair share already. Thank you very much.
Special thanks to Dr. Colin Young for his presentation. At this time, we'll move right into our next presentation. It will be done by Mr. Jonathan Liu. He has a background in international business, both a Master's of Science and a Bachelor's. He has past experience as being the Deputy Director of the Technical Cooperation Department of Taiwan ICDF, and he has held various positions, including Division Chief at the Taiwan ICDF. His specialties are in economic analysis, financial management, and industry analysis. At this time, he's going to bring to you a presentation entitled Solutions for Climate Mitigation and Adaptation at Cross-Central Governmental and Municipal Levels. Please welcome Mr. Jonathan Liu.
Thank you, moderator, for your kind introduction. And honorable ministers, CEOs, and the panelists, and the ladies and gentlemen, I'm Jonathan Liu, coming from the Taiwan ICDF, and it's my honor to be here again. I would like to take these opportunities to express my gratitude to the government of Belize and the Taiwan Research Institute to co-host this meaningful side event. And I would like to share some of my experience and practices in climate mitigation and adaptations at municipal levels. And this is my outline skeletons of presentation today. And first of all, I would like to share, have a short introductions our institutions and let you know who we are and what we do for the climate resilient programs. And followed by I just take a little bit talk about the city's challenge and climate change. And after that, and show you our several cases in different countries, how we are our engagement in these areas. And finally, the conclusions. The ICDF is 100% government-owned or government-funded institutions, the largest foreign aid agency in Taiwan. And our core competence involves providing people, capital, knowledge, and technology to support the economic development and enhance the human resources, as well as promote the bilateral relationships with like-minded countries. And our objectives mainly focus on 4 strategies, as you see in your right side of the slide. And so far, we have 21 technical missions with around 230 professionals overseas in the field to carry out more than 74 ongoing programs in 33 countries. And basically, our work is tailor-made to local needs of the partner countries. So our investment covers a variety of development issues. So we select the agricultural, environment, public health, and education, ICT, environmental, as well as MSME as our priorities. So how about the cities and the climate change? What's the relationship between these factors? Climate change is a global phenomenon that largely impacts on urban life. Temperature rising causes sea level to rise and increase the frequency of extreme weathers and the spread of tropical diseases. So all of these have a significant impact on urban infrastructures and people livelihood. So at the same time, cities are also a key contributors to climate change. According to research show that urban activities are responsible for more than 75% of global emissions. So it's very essential to make the cities as an integral part of solutions in fighting the climate change. So many cities, but actually many cities are doing a lot by using renewable energy solutions, introducing a new productive technique, and also build up some incentives or regulations to limit the industrial emissions. And cutting emissions will also reduce air pollution from industry and transport, therefore improving the citizen health. So the next one, I will give you some topics to talking about how our engagement in different areas. The first one is in Belize. Belize is one of the countries that in the world that's most affected by hurricane and flood. So according to research show that in the last 20 years, losses from extreme weather disasters amount to 7% of Belize GDP, with 19 days per 100,000 persons due to natural disasters. So the Taiwan ICDF funded these programs And we use web-based technology to monitor the potential flood areas and river water levels when the disaster is about to strike. So people in such dangerous areas, they can easily get real-time information to reduce responding time by 30% and earn more time to evacuate to the safe places. So something makes this project very special is that we have educated the local people the concept of a community-based risk reductions to raise their disaster awareness. And the overall goal of this project was to increase the disaster response efficiency and early warning time. The second one it was energy efficiency in Paraguay. Paraguay's electricity supplies currently serves more than 99% of populations. But the point of power generation is pretty high. It's pretty far from the main consumption hubs. It's almost more than 400 kilometers. So the current transmission capacity is not enough to secure reliable supply given the forecast demand. So in this case, we team up with IDB, Inter-American Direct Bank, on a parallel co-financing basis to optimize the transmission system countrywide. The project goal was to enhance the reliabilities and the efficiencies of the electricity service by cutting down the transmission loss. In this case, the selected routes of transmission systems go through the farmlands and nature's habitat. So in the project beginning or project plan stage, we adopted mitigation measures to minimize the negative impacts and prevent any conversions to nature's. Even if still have some moderators, environmental and social impacts, we can totally handle it with some certain compensations alternatives. And this case is our new energies for mobilities in the cities. In this case, I will show you how we suppose a green transition for public transportation in Lithuania. The Vilnius is most populous cities in Lithuania and the second largest cities in Baltic states. So to echo the government sustainable urban mobility plans, Taiwan ICDF and the EBRDs are co-financing the Vilnius bus companies to purchase more than 90 electric trolley buses with battery technologies of autonomous driving and with zero tailpipe emissions. This will support the bus companies in transitioning to all electric vehicles and contribute to reduce CO2 emission by 2,200 tons in every single year. And these investments will serve as a trigger project for Vilnius to transition towards to greener cities. And the last one is talking about the waste management in small island states. In the Caribbean regions, the country of St. Kitts and Nevis has a diversified landscape and seascape, where the tourism sector is very popular. However, there is no land space and technology to treat of solid waste and recycles. So this small island states has been facing a very severe environmental stress which will be restricted the national development. So in this regard, and based on the experiences of recycling and waste reductions what we have in Taiwan, we propose a technical assistance to reduce public plastic garbage by 75% through developing a recycling models to generate potential benefit from the waste disposals. For the government, the authority is encouraged to draft a regulatory framework for waste reduction and recycling in terms of private sectors. A feasible profit-driven models introduced to promote the ideas of a recycling economies, which enables residents easy to collect, throw, and wash, shred, compress plastic waste to valuable material for circular economies. Conclusions. The impacts of climate change are not just the main issue, urgent issue of these centuries. And Taiwan, as part of our global communities, will not leave our partner countries behind, and we do not be left behind either. And in closing, I would like to emphasize how we are looking forward to all opportunities to engage municipal green transitions. This is not only represents our efforts being recognized on a global societies, but also very optimistic outlook on how we could make the cities a much more diverse and green-based platform. Therefore, Taiwan ICDF are ready to align with like-minded partners. I conclude here, and thank you for listening.
Special thanks to Mr. Jonathan Liu for his presentation. We'll now go into our next presentation. I'd just like to notify the speakers that we were a little behind time, and I know with these events they're very, very strict with time. So let me just introduce to you Ms. Rose Yen. She's the Deputy Director of the 3rd Research Division of Taiwan Research Institute, and she leads teams researching climate policies, including climate governance, climate finance, and public engagement. At this time, she's going to bring to you a presentation entitled Promoting a Just Transition to Net Zero Emissions by 2050, International Case Studies and Taiwan's Experience. Welcome her, please.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I'm Wan Ting-yen from Taiwan Research Institute. Okay, so today I'd like to share with you the issue of just transition from both international and local perspective of views. So first of all, the concept of a just transition has its origins dating back to the 1970s and has evolved over nearly 50 years. In recent years, it has gained mainstream attention and become a crucial element in policy making, particularly due to the need for a sustainable transition in responding to climate change. However, the scope of a just transition has varied across different decades, and regions and different stakeholders have emphasized different aspects of it to suit their specific needs, resulting in diverse interpretations of the concept. So, according to a retrospective report supported by the UNRISD, the evolution of a just transition can be roughly divided into 3 major stages, which is domestic labor movement, the global campaign, and principle for climate action. I'd like to keep the details later. So the first explicit mention of a just transition in the resolution text can be traced back to COP16. And last year, during COP27, the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan was adopted, and the conference decided to establish the work program on just transition pathway. So the advocacy for a just transition is also shown in other international platforms, such as APEC. At this year's APEC Energy Ministers meeting, the resolutions established established include the Just Energy Transition Initiative and the non-binding APEC Principles for Just Energy Transition based on the other two APEC resolutions. So according to the resolution of it, the Energy Working Group was tasked with referencing the concept of decent work and the La Serena Roadmap for Women and Inclusive Growth from APEC. And this reference was to establish the Just Transition Initiative aimed at accelerating the energy transition within APEC economies while adhering to the 10 APEC principles for just energy transition. In addition to international organizations, many internationally renowned research institutes have also proposed guidelines and initiatives to plan and promote a just transition. For example, the SEI from Stockholm and the USC peer from the USA. Okay. So this year, our institute also conducted case studies on 15 countries, analyzing various aspects of their just transition efforts, including the background, the governance structure, implementation processes, key policies, and accompanying measures of just transition. So please don't worry, there won't be another 15 slides. After, I will only share 2 key observations. The first observation revolves around the establishment of governance structure. We found that in the design of just transition systems, they can be broadly categorized into expanding existing mechanisms and creating new governance mechanisms. These 2 design approaches reflect the distinction between countries that are early adopters and early latecomers in the field of just transition. And the second key point concerns strategy development. Just transition strategies in various countries can be broadly categorized into 3 types: the regional development, industrial development, and labor employment security. This table only reflects the current focus of specific countries in their just transition efforts. Since just transition is still an emerging issue, the current policy landscape in each country is largely determined by the historical or current policy emphasis. Okay, so I'd like to share some experience from Taiwan, and this is the timeline of just transition, the process in Taiwan. In 2021, there is a net zero goal. In 2050 was set up. And then in 2022, there is a roadmap to be raised. And after then, in the same year, there are 12 key strategy action plans were raised, and one of them is the topic for just transition. So in this year, there is a legislation for include a provisions for just transition. And later this year, there is a establishment of Taiwan's Just Transition Committee. So regarding the establishment of a governance structure of just transition in Taiwan, we can see that we will have a planning authority to summarize and monitoring the overall progress of just transition, and it will also develop budget review rules for other competent authorities to follow. And other authorities, they have to identify the impacts and to formulate the responding measures of just transition. And furthermore, to enhance stakeholder engagement, a Just Transition Committee has been established, comprising representatives from industry, academia, and NGOs. The committee is divided into four subgroups, like academy, strategy review, issue identification, and influence. They provide specific consultation respectively. So regarding to the strategy development of just transition in Taiwan, there is an ultimate goal, which is to reach net zero in 2050, and followed by 12 key strategies. One of them is just transition. Subsequently, the government establishes mechanisms for assessing, implementing, and monitoring just transition policies, continuously adjusting the content of policy measures to align with the actual needs of stakeholders. So my presentation ends here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Ms. Rose Yan, and thank you for taking note of the time also. We've reduced the time gap from about 10 minutes to 7 minutes to your presentation. We'll now have our next presentation by Dr. Maria Rolim. Let me introduce her briefly. She's a lawyer and economist. She's a visiting scholar at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University Law School. She has a PhD in energy law and sustainability from Center of Energy, Petroleum and Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee, Scotland. She's going to bring to you a presentation entitled Transnational Regulation as a Tool to Foster Collaboration Towards Inclusive Net Zero Targets, South American Perspective. Please welcome her.
Thank you very much. Hi, good night, everyone, or good evening. I'm going to share with you a little bit of, let's say, a backbone of structure about cooperation. We all talk a lot about cooperation and how we need cooperation to get the net zero and so on, so forth and so on. But I'm trying to structure what is cooperation in legal terms, what is cooperation that we can enforce or to use it to pursue net zero transition in a more structured way. Let me see. Cooperation has this idea. Sorry, I don't have. That's fine. It's just I thought it would be here. Sorry. Cooperation has this idea of decentralized regulation in terms of climate governance, let's say. So you need to have kind of, it is the idea that you, not only the state does regulation, different actors, multiple actors can do regulation when they organize themselves in a certain way. So you have this integrated view of regulation that is a kind of, you need an objective or something to pursue, but you have a multi-level network that is able to pursue this aim, and then we don't have the only one actor like the state, as we used to perceive regulation as something that came only from the state. Transnational regulation is the idea that is a regulation made in transnational level, with supposed to have an objective, a global one, like climate change, influencing behavior, these objectives to influence behavior to achieve some specific result like net zero, or let's say the warming, the mitigation, adaptation, and so on. And is not under this regulation, this capacity to do regulation is not under sole and exclusively control of national authorities. It can involve a multiplicity of no-state actors subject to different jurisdictions. That is actually what we are talking about when we are talking about tackle climate change. That is not a disclaimer, please. That is not something that I created. I used a structure from an LSE professor, but she used that much for environmental law, for environmental study, and I'm trying to expand it for regulation in general. And the kind of cooperation agreements that you have under this idea of the center of the regulation, they can be public and public, private with private ideas, and under public and public you can have, for instance, the Paris Agreement, which is a treaty, a legal piece, but you can also have some kind of other initiatives. Usually under public and public you have a legal enforceable treaty, but you can also have private and private examples as public and private as well, and private and public not so often, but it is when some public authorities they adopt some private standards, let's say. But the structure is to identify the regulation, this exercise to reach some aim. It is specifically need to have a specific objective to achieve. And you need a purpose that is instruments to reach that, tools, objectives, and then an authority, which means the status to a governance, I would say, a status to implement that, and some consequence of no cooperation and as external impacts. This consequence can be directly, like a penalty or something, if it is enforceable and legally enforceable, but can also be indirectly, like to miss or to lose the trust, the international community trust, or things like that, or to lack access to financing, or things like that. So. And transnational climate initiatives are directly addressing climate change. They operate transnationally, and they also involve different parties, 2 countries at least, and non-state actors. That is exactly what we're talking about. And they seek foster and steer action towards a specific goal, in our case, to contain, mitigate, and adapt to climate change. And then this cross-level governance involves states, civil society, NGOs, corporations, government levels, different government levels. And that's exactly what we see at COP, when we see different actors trying to reach something. I'm trying to bring this discussion under the idea of structured cooperation, because we always talk about cooperation in all the rooms I've been in, but we don't know exactly what we can do with this cooperation, how we can challenge government to say, you agreed to cooperate in something, you have some legal obligation or moral obligation when you say, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to lend this money or do that. It doesn't matter if it is in right or not. You decided to cooperate to reach that, so you can demand it, society, we can demand that from the government itself. To show a little bit 3 examples, and I'm not exhausting you, I promise, it is like how it is important to level this competence, this multi-level competence. In Brazil, for instance, I'm from Brazil, I'm based in Brazil, we have a very difficult issue related to environmental competence to approve infrastructure, to license, and so on. It's difficult for the investors, and it's difficult for society to deal with that, because you have the state level, the federal one, the member states, and also the federal district, which is the capital of Brazil, that has some kind of competence, and also the huge amount of municipalities. So you have all of them, they have a bit of the competence in terms of environmental issues, the local interest in something, and there is no hierarchy between the laws, and then you have to deal with all this mess with difficulties, the way society can place itself to demand some kind of coherence among the decisions of the government. It's just to show an example when cooperation and alignment of competences is really important. But going to our examples, you have, for instance, under the transnational climate governance, this multi-level climate governance, this cooperation among actors, and the internationalization of initiatives. And that's something that we need to explore more. We are all in our countries trying to find solutions and trying to divide the world like the South and the global, and to have money from the North to the South and things like this kind of discussion or approach, while we still have instruments to do a more cooperative way. So Paris Agreement is this idea of international regulation of public. You have a purpose, in this case is global and transnational, that is a standard that is to have this below 1.5 degree, nowadays more 2 degrees, unfortunately. An enforcement idea, you have the direct enforcement, which is kind of soft because the treaty, as all international instruments, international law instruments, have some limitations. But this indirectly enforcement, it is through climate litigation. It is a legal piece of, it is a piece of legal piece of test. So it can be invoked, it can be relied on by society to demand something. Although it's not easy, it's something that is growing and more. So what we want to do is, governments, please, when you do something, although it's not binding directly, we can make it indirectly binding to some way through cooperation, because cooperation is a legal obligation to give at least accountability, at least to say what you did, what you didn't, and why. And then you have the Global Compact, which is a private agreement again. You have the UN 17 ODS, the objectives of the sustainable development. Sorry, I said in Portuguese, I guess so. But it is something that companies agree to. I work with a lot of companies, private companies. When they go to this, they expose themselves to greenwashing litigation as well. They expose themselves when they say, I'm going to do this. I advise companies and I say, don't promise whatever you cannot deliver, because we will be saying that we're going to do, and the other day will be on the newspapers. That's my last slide, don't worry. And then you have an alliance which is private and private as well, the Rainforest Alliance. It's very successful. They they invest themselves, they have a lot of parties taking part, and they build capacity through standards and through a movement that raise capacity in the parties, and the people voluntarily take part on this, but they have consequences if they don't. The consequence is, in this case, not to have the good part of it, that is the recognition of the society that they have this standard, this certification. Sometimes it's not to be it's not the enforceability is not a penalty, but is related to something that you cannot monetize as a benefit for your business, for instance. So that is my last slide, just to remind us the importance of aligned competence, and I'm always trying to give some legal structure for things. Otherwise, we keep just putting, wasting words like cooperation and things like that, and all end up not being enforceable. So we need to think as students, as I'm a teacher as well and student as well, ways to put things in a legal format or enforceable format to demand what is our right, actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Ms. Maria Rolim for her presentation. We'll now have our final presentation before the discussion. We'll take a few questions after this presentation. It will be brought to us by Mr. Muhammad Ali. He's a rising star of the in the sustainability field. He's a visionary entrepreneur who is transforming traditional waste management in industry. He's the CEO and co-founder of IFAS, which is a Dubai-based circular economy startup committed to closed-loop resource recovery. He's going to bring to us a presentation entitled Circular Economy Financing for Net Zero Transition. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Mr. Collin. All right. I'll do my best to stick to the time, especially towards the end. But first, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be among this esteemed panel to discuss the critical role of circular economy financing in achieving the global net zero transition. Now, growing up in Nigeria and now residing in Dubai for close to 20 years, I have observed the devastating impacts of climate change, including desertification, droughts, extreme weather events, and rising sea levels. We've heard some of these things from the panelists and the honorable. These impacts are not unique to these regions, so towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to ask you to just, there are two images here, try to guess where they're from. And then tonight, instead of the standard presentation, I'm going to tell you a quick story. And it starts with, among other things, me being the co-founder of EFAS, a circular economy company that is committed to closed-loop resource recovery. While doing this job, I have also witnessed firsthand the transformative potential of circularity in reducing our environmental impact and creating a more sustainable future. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that as a practical way to demonstrate some of what my colleagues have mentioned in terms of, for example, in Belize, where they're leading in these discussions. How do we raise those voices? How do we practically implement some of the ideas that my colleague was mentioning? Essentially, what attracts me to the circular economy concept itself is the idea of going back to the root. If it is a product, how do we go back to the design of the product to make sure that it is as circular as can be with what we have today in our societies, instead of just focusing on the end result. For example, in my area of waste management, we always focus on sorting and segregation and education, but how do we go back to design? So this is the angle that I'm going to take us through. Essentially, what we do at EFAS, or what we have done over the past few years, is to take the food and consumer goods industry as a case study, and then instead of materials going into landfill, we have a unique approach where you look at the packaging, there are solutions for the plastic, for the paper, for the cardboard, but what we focus on is the contents, where we repurpose those goods, those materials that are typically unwanted, and we convert them into useful materials for other industries. And this is what we're trying to highlight here. So essentially, we are able to divert materials from going into landfill through that intervention that we're making, as well as adding research, technology, innovation to create never-before-seen products. Some of these products, such as car wash, that has been made from your household shampoos that you may have used this morning, or degreasers that are made from lotions. These degreasers can now then go to the public sector, wash abattoirs and public toilets or warehouses, whatever, thereby minimizing the need to use virgin materials to produce these cleaning products again. In the case of the car wash, you go to the industrial areas, you can wash machines and so on and so forth. Repurposing soaps, we've heard of that. Even your perfumes, we're able to turn that into surface disinfectants that can kill 99% of germs today. And this is all scientifically proven, by the way. Now, why am I talking about all of this? The World Economic Forum already has shared with us that the circular economy concept can add about $1 trillion of economic value to the world economy by 2025. This includes 11 million jobs and so on. These are all things that we know. So how, from a private sector perspective, how do we take this research that is available and how do we action it? How do we then, let's say, laser focus it towards mitigation, adaptation, just transition, and so on and so forth? We already know that in the global south, we're owed, sort of. So how do we then take all this knowledge and weaponize it to make sure that we're helping ourselves first, and then go demand what it is that we need to get. So when it comes to financing, what we typically see is that there is any number of funds out there, from the Green Climate Fund that my colleague mentioned, all the way down to funds in practically any country. The mismatch comes from, one, the funds are usually available a little bit too late. When a disaster happens, then we're able to access the funds. Before the disaster happens, then it's a lot of bureaucracy. That's the first thing. And then secondly, when you go through this process of accessing the funds, what happens is you realize that the metrics from the financing sector and the metrics in reality, there's this mismatch. So we hear that there's money being available. We see even examples that this money is being dispersed, but there just seems to be something. We did a little study in the private sector, and we talked to some communities, again, from my vantage point of being, able to seamlessly go between two continents. I was able to get real-world insights into how almost it is a turn-off these days. What we came up with, basically, is that today, the traditional financing tools that are available, as nice as they are, they're just not fit for purpose. They were designed and built for an era that was not circular, let's say. They served a specific purpose, and the future of finance and financing needs to be circular. We need to rethink, we need to reframe, and we need to rework all these mechanisms in order to serve the problems that we're trying to address today. Otherwise, there's always going to be this mismatch. There's always going to be so much talking, excuse me, and there's always going to be not enough action, or action that is a little bit too little, too late. I just wanted to, again, zoom in a little bit. Why am I talking about these points so boldly? This is a picture of me that my team insisted I put there. This is the team from the Dubai municipality. They regularly engage with us. I was giving them a tour of our facility while they were conducting a study on the air quality in Dubai, which is something that they do regularly. We engage with them from the local level to the state level. They consult with us. It's interesting because when we started, there was nothing like a circular economy license, let's say. It was waste management and recycling. But the interesting thing here, in spite of what you hear in the news, is that there's so much engagement from the government to the private sector. As soon as you have anything that is innovative on paper, first of all, the ease of doing business, they engage with you, trying to learn with you, instead of that top-down approach that maybe we're used to. So I thought it was, we can do a Q&A on the details, but in the interest of time, this to me, these images to me are the key when it comes to cross-level governance, because we live it every day here. And it is so crucial to a sustainable future. More importantly, when I think about the fact that kids like us that have called this place a second home are able to make this direct impact into the UAE society, more than millions of kilograms of waste that are diverted away from Dubai landfills. We today contribute directly to a cleaner air that we breathe in Dubai and across the UAE. On top of that, we did not rely on those funds that the paperwork required to access funding. Everything was bootstrapped. We had nothing but an idea. And then the environment, more importantly, talking about cross-level governance, the environment that facilitated anyone to come and do business and to be able to make a direct impact in the society. Essentially, innovation is what fuels us, and innovation fuels that journey towards net zero. When you're talking about adaptation or resilience in a society, innovation typically comes from bottom up. When communities start to help themselves, right? And when they get the support, the barriers are eliminated, whether it is at the local level or state or federal, whatever it is that the public sector is able to do, the private sector usually is that catalyst. And that collaboration with the private sector is absolutely crucial if we are to achieve that net zero by 2050 that we're all aspiring to do. So again, in the interest of time, just let's say the image on the left is a desert from the UAE, and the image on the right is a desert from Nigeria. The point is climate change affects all of us. You can Google this, by the way. Join us as we give youth resources a new life. We firmly believe in cross-level governance. Dubai and the UAE, we believe, from our point of view, can be a case study, a model that can be exported to other regions so that we can at least kickstart and move from the discussion to actionism. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Muhammad Ali for his presentation. In listening to him, you can't help but be proud of his success in the work that he's doing here in Dubai. So thank you. We have exactly 10 minutes to close, and we want to take a few questions. I know you have your questions. Just put your hands up. We'll bring a mic to you. Introduce yourself and the organization that you represent, and just ask your question to the panel. Thank you. We have one person on my left that wants to ask. No, he was waving to somebody. Yes? Is there a mic? Okay.
Great question. I didn't elaborate too much on stage about it, but in the entrepreneurial community, again, before we came here, we did do a little bit of research. What we found is that there's this mismatch between what the fund managers are looking for and what really impact means in terms of circular economy. They talk about returns for the investors now, as I showed in one of the slides. They talk about numbers and figures and ROI, and the metric from that angle seems to be how much money you've raised instead of how much impact you have made or are going to make or want to make. And the way you measure impact, sometimes maybe we need to keep the money discussion, the dollar amount aside, make sure that the impact is right, and then find a way to bridge these two worlds. Again, what we're trying to point out is that we have nothing against them. They are not wrong. It's just that they've been built, trained, based on a different set of criteria versus what the world needs today. There's a glimmer of hopes, little by little here and there, but a lot more needs to be done. Otherwise, we will keep coming to every COP and it will be the same thing. I'm glad that today is the day of finance, and climate finance is a big discussion, but let's move. We know where the problems are. The scientists and the people much, much smarter than us have already, proven everything. Let's just take one step forward and recategorize or realign what it means to actually fund climate, because it's not about return on investments in the traditional way.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I think banks now have some KPIs, they have to come out with some green loan for that. But I think that's a dilemma, for small enterprise, I'm not sure how big you are, but I think you refer yourself as a startup. So then there's always a kind of mismatch gap between all these big monies, and they actually, for the small enterprise, they don't have enough collateral or credit, or their project might not solid enough to get a grant. I think, I'm not sure how panel is, especially I think ladies, you are focusing low, right? So any regulations that you can come out for these that you can close the gap for that. Otherwise, it's always the big players versus like all these small fishes that are trying to survive. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak a little bit about that. Yeah, in fact, I'm a lawyer and I'm an economist as well, so I do see this gap between the discussion has many levels, let's say. When today is the Finance Day, I was in a panel before that, and we were talking about the global and the North and the South. And on the table was myself from Brazil, someone from South Africa, someone from India, and discussing how we can close the gap between the money in a global scale, like United States, China, this and that, and the money for the South. That's one issue. Another one, as you said, is how to raise money on the ground inside your country, how to make the money to arrive there. I think the development banks have the potential to do that, and in Brazil, specifically that I know, I don't know the other ones that much, they divide they separate under a certain amount, they have a specific group to look at and to raise money in a different way. And more than that, you go for the big projects and things like that. But even though I still feel the same, as he said, my colleague said, even under certain amounts, there is this disconnection between what they are looking for and what the impact is. They just accept it's a problem of taxonomy, I would say. Our taxonomy is being built under the same concepts we used to have. So return is important, but impact is just assumed that the project has to be a positive impact, it has to have to produce a positive impact, but they don't measure, they don't do a differentiated in terms of interest rates or things like that if you have a better impact than the other business. So it's like the impact is always the same metrics and the money is different. So I think we need to regulate that, and Brazil at this moment they are consulting a new taxonomy to do that, but we still don't have the results, and I still see some gaps there, but I see some advancements as well, some progress.
Not hearing. I think this is very very interesting, and thank you, Ali, for that I think inspiring presentation. I represent, and I come from a region of small islands and small countries. And sometimes I think it's important to understand that while we're all suffering the effects of climate change, the extent to which we are being impacting and the capacity of us to be able to respond, and even with the private sector and innovations are constrained. We're talking about a country like St. Kitts and Nevis, where the entire population is 42,000 people. Right, so putting in place a solid waste sort of recycling company, when you look at, you simply don't even have the waste, the volume of waste, to be able to make it a feasible investment. So because when you look at the rate of return, there's none to be had. It's the same thing when you're looking at trying to use waste to energy as a mechanism. When you don't get the scale. And when you don't get the scale, then the cost of the capital because of debt, that's the next issue, and debt that is caused because of climate change. When we have to rebuild the streets and the schools and the houses and the hospitals because of constant destruction from climate change, your debt to GDP ratio keeps going up and up. Yeah. What that means now, when you're trying to attract the private sector to come into your country, you have the issue of the cost of capital. And so we are borrowing, the cost of capital for us is 12, 13, 14, 15, up to 20%. You know what kind of business you have to be generating in terms of income to be able to service that kind of return? And before you know it, what happens then is the governments find themselves trying to have to sign away all kinds of incentives to the private sector companies. So I think it's important to recognize that some of us are in different places where certain innovations and certain solutions are possible, and there are others where those aren't possible. And in those types of environment, what we're saying is that climate finance and access to concessional financing is what is needed to help bridge that gap between the public sector finance, resources from governments that they have, because we are in this sort of, I think perhaps I shouldn't use the religious analogy of purgatory, you know, sort of between in no man's land kind of speak. But our islands and countries are mostly middle income countries. And so we don't qualify for concessional financing from the international financing system because our per capita GDP is too high to qualify. I think the category right now is that if you're making just a little under $2,000 per capita, you don't qualify for World Bank financing. Our countries are at 8,000, 9,000, 12,000 per capita, and so we are locked out of the concessional market, but we are at the same time the heaviestly impact from climate change. And when something wipes out 20% of your GDP or 100% of your GDP, even the access to the financing to rebuild is at non-concessional rates. So, you know, larger Brazil, the UAE, Singapore, Barbados, St. Kitts, Belize, we are at very different places as it relates to how we can access financing to fund our resilience. It doesn't mean that there's not space for innovation, however. There is always space for innovation, but the way we go about financing it is going to be at a different scale and very different in terms of the strategy.
Can I just add something? It's really interesting, sorry about that, because in this case, I see more as a legal lens as reparation, actually. It's not to access to finance. It's something that the world has some responsibility towards what's happened there. Because sometimes that's the thing. Finance is one thing.
Yes.
Loss and damage is another thing. Yeah, and that's the thing we need to discuss, because some people say it's business. Okay, it has to have a return, capital return and so on. I'm an economist as well, but it's not business all the time. Sometimes it's reparation, sometimes it's common responsibility, is a lot of other moral things that are in law as well. So we just see money as you use it to do, and it's not climate finance. Actually.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. When the discussion is now getting hyped up, I have to be the one to stop it, you know. I wish if we had more time for a discussion, but we're actually out of time. We've heard some very important points. We know that just transition is very important, and there are many barriers that countries face. How we can bridge those barriers include accessing finance, technology, capacity building, and so forth. And we even heard about changes in governance that can move us in that direction. And so I encourage all of you, let's keep working together in our national capacities to ensure that we can transition from wherever we are. I would like to thank the organizers, the government of Taiwan. I'd like to thank the presenters that are up here with me. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being here and for gracing us with your presence. Just give yourself a round of applause. Thank you. Just let's